Welcome back to the Pediatric Speech Sisters Show. I am so excited for our guest today. We have here Germaine Graham. Many might know her as Definitely Communicating. She is a speech pathologist and she is specialized with the deaf and hard of hearing community. So I will go ahead and let her introduce herself. But Germaine, the reason why I brought you here on the show is because deaf and hard of hearing is a culture. And many people don't think of it that way. And so there are many ways that speech pathologists and other people who interact with the deaf and hard of hearing community that is completely out of line without us even knowing. And maybe even some implicit biases that we have. And so I would love to just hear your insight about your experience, your background, and how we could be better advocates for this community. So I'll go ahead and let you take it away.
Well, thank you. And thank you, Melanie, for the invitation to be on your platform and to share this space with you. I love talking about what I do and I love talking about the deaf community and working alongside the deaf community and just being a part of the community, even as a hearing person. So I'm really excited. I told you already, I'm super nervous, but I'm excited to be here with you guys. So you've introduced me. I am Germaine. I am the founder and CEO of Definitely Communicating. I am a speech language pathologist who is ASL-fluent. And what I do primarily is empower parents, empower deaf children, deaf youth, deaf adults, and support their communication. I use my platform on Definitely Communicating to educate, to advocate, to spotlight, and to just bring more awareness on the deaf community or to the deaf community. What my approach is bilingual, bimodal. And so I do use American Sign Language primarily in my work with students, but it always depends on, how they communicate as well. So that's a little bit about what I do. Yeah.
Well, thank you for that introduction. And I did also want to ask, we do have an interpreter here, an incredible interpreter, and I would love for you to introduce yourself because there are people watching this who are just amazed by what you are doing. And I know that it's a gift. So if you'd be willing to introduce yourself to the audience.
I don't mind. My name is Nakaya Hollins. I'm an interpreter, and Gigi and I have worked together some. And so I feel really privileged to be here and involved in this conversation. So thank you for inviting me, Gigi.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, ladies. So, Jermaine, my first question, I always ask guests on the show this question. What is your why? What got you into the field? And what gets you up every day? Why do you keep doing what you're doing?
All right, three-part question. If I forget something, you let me know.
That's all right. That's all
My why, I just love to help. I love to serve. I'm passionate about communication. I am not like a big platform kind of outgoing person, but I love small talk. I love just to get to know people and to connect, really authentically. I love to be known and understood. And I love to see other people have that same experience. And so that's what kind of led me to the field of speech language pathology. I like to tell a little bit of background because I didn't know about the field actually before I got to school. I actually started off thinking I would be a dentist. I used to have braces and I love straight teeth, but I thought I would go to school and become a dentist. And I got really bogged down with all of the science classes and just felt like it was not for me, not my thing, not something that I was really connected to. And so when I talked to my advisor, and she started asking me questions about, what is it that you really enjoy? What are you most passionate about? What really are things that stand out to you? Then once she listened to me, she heard me kind of answer those questions. She told me about the field of speech language pathology, and I attended Jackson State. I don't think I mentioned that, but went and they had a program there at Jackson State. So that's what I actually switched my major to, was communicative disorders. And once I started taking those classes, then I was like, okay, it still has a touch of science to it. And so I felt like the two fields kind of came together really well. Um, the second part of that question I have already forgotten, so remind me what it is.
Oh, I think you actually did answer the second part, how you got into
Okay.
the pressure. Oh, and also just so what makes you keep going? And even about definitely communicating, how did you fall? So if you started with dentistry, how did you even fall into the deaf and hard and hearing community?
Thank you.
Yeah.
So, what in Jackson, Mississippi, Jackson State is located about 15 to 20 minutes away from the Mississippi School for the Deaf. But even before that, when I changed my major, we had to have an elective. I found out that Jackson State offered elective classes where I could take American Sign Language. And so that actually took me back to a high school experience that I had. My first high school job was working at McDonald's. And on that job, I actually met my first two deaf adults. And I've tried my best to communicate with them despite us being, different in terms of how we communicated. I really, like I said, I like to talk to people on a small one-to-one, small scale level. And so that always kind of piqued my interest. And so I learned a bit of ASL on the job then, nowhere near what I know now, but I knew that I wanted to learn more. And so when I had that opportunity to take ASL as an elective, I did that, later found out about the School for the Deaf, and it just kind of was a beautiful marriage from there. The School for the Deaf was my first job out of high school. And so once I found out as an SLP that I could work at a deaf school, I did my observation there. I did my clinical fellowship year at the Mississippi School for the Deaf. And I always like to say that if not for my peers, my colleagues, the kids, the students that I had my first year as an SLP, I wouldn't know what I know now, because I entered knowing basic American Sign Language and just was thrown into a fully immersive experience every single day, being in a signing environment. And that's what helped develop my skills, and then also my understanding and my knowledge of the deaf community, of deaf culture, and just the different perspectives that are out there. And that's what gets me up every single day. I really, really, really love this community. My best friends are deaf. It's something that I just feel like God has led me to, because like I said, from a dentist to a speech pathologist that works specifically with the deaf community, that's not like a logical progression, but it's something that I am deeply passionate about. And I love serving the families that I work with and just advocating alongside the deaf community.
Well, thank you so much for thank you so much. That was so powerful. That really was. And I felt the heart and the spirit in it. So I'm very thankful that you are here and that you're serving this community. So one of the things that I was mentioning in your introduction is how many people don't think of deaf and hard of hearing as a community, as a culture. Could you, and I know that you yourself are not deaf and hard of hearing, but just even being connected to the community, how could we reframe our mindsets to even consider people who are deaf and hard of hearing a culture?
Well, I think it's important to remember, I think in our particular field, or in the professional space, we hear a lot about, the different models of disability. And I think it's important when we start to talk about the deaf community, though there are some within the community that view their deafness as a disability, or even deaf people that do have additional disabilities. I think it's important to remember that when we talk about culture, we talk about identity, right? We talk about the ways that people communicate. We talk about their views on how they see themselves. And so within the deaf community, you have a group of people that are viewed as culturally deaf, which means that they communicate using American Sign Language, right? And they also fully embrace their deaf identity and their deafness. It's not seen as something that they want to fix or something that they want to change, but it's just who they are. It's part of their identity. And so I think it's also very important, though, of course, as a hearing person, I could never speak on behalf of the entire deaf community. And so even within saying that, there are nuances, right? There is a spectrum. And just because a person might identify one way right now and kind of view their deafness in a certain way, or even fluctuate at times, wishing things might be different, or, whatever the case may be, I just think it's important to recognize that there is a spectrum within deafness, and to know, though, that there are people that are culturally deaf and may have been raised even by deaf parents. Even though that's a small percentage of people, there are deaf children born to deaf parents. Even though the percentage of deaf children born to deaf parents is low, that is something to keep in mind as well. And so when you meet that deaf child or that deaf adult, you don't really know their background or their upbringing. But it's important to remember that some do really, really, really cherish their deaf identity.
And I appreciate you saying that, because what's coming up for me is I remember I used to work at a hotel in Washington, D.C., and there is a woman who worked with me. She wasn't deaf, but her parents were both deaf. So she was a part of the community by having deaf parents. And at the time, I didn't really consider how much of what am I trying to say? I didn't really realize how much it even could have maybe affected her growing up, because she's, of course, fluent in sign and everything, and she has certain sensitivities to it too. If people are insensitive to deaf and hard of hearing people, but even in that case, what could we do to console, for example, a child who has deaf and hard of hearing parents? In
Well,
this-
and I think that's the thing, not necessarily coming in and seeing it as an automatic problem, or
Mhm.
seeing it as something that's unusual. Seeing it's something that we don't see often, but there's nothing unusual about it, right? And so, really, just stepping in and not coming in to fix, but coming in to observe, coming in to respect, and let that lead any conversation. If you notice that a child has deaf parents, it's not a situation for pity, it's not a situation for concern. Deaf people are fully capable of raising children. They do it every single day. Deaf people can do anything. And so I think that as providers, it's important to remember that. And ultimately, I think it boils down in a big way to respect, and not really forcing, deaf families or even children of deaf adults, CODAs, to necessarily operate a certain way or communicate a certain way. We're kind of, I can't remember, what we discussed prior to now, but just even understanding that a lot of times we place heavy emphasis on speech and, oral communication from the mouth, but that's not necessarily what the emphasis should be on. And so in a situation like that, there may be concern, and there often is concern, especially from speech language pathologists. Well, nobody's talking to this child all day. Her parents are deaf. Well, that's okay. It really is, because if her parents are deaf and use American Sign Language, the child is still getting lots of language we would expect on a daily basis, even though it's not through speech, right? Even though it's not through spoken means, American Sign Language is a language just like English is. And that child is being exposed to language through American Sign Language. So the speech can develop later, but the important thing is for language really to be embedded and ingrained in our children.
I really like how you said that ASL is just as much of a language as English is. I really appreciate that statement. So that brings me to my next question. When we're thinking about the bilingual, bimodal approach, how can we go about that in intervention?
So that's pretty much what I do on a day-to-day basis when I'm working with clients. The bilingual part of that is two languages. So American Sign Language, again, an equivalent language to English, to any other language out there, spoken or signed language. So that's the one part. And then the other language is English, so ASL and English. The bimodal part of that is that the sign is produced on the hands, and full body, but on the hands.
Mhm.
And then, speech, if we're working on spoken English, then from the mouth, or even written English. And so thinking about that in terms of intervention, again, this is very individualized. So, you may not emphasize or work on the languages equally, but it's about maintaining that access for that client, right? And if a client that I have is deaf and they use American Sign Language, I'm not going to come in very heavy on the English and start, thinking, oh my gosh, they have all these deficits, they don't understand this, they don't understand that. What I do is prioritize the language that is most accessible to them first. And usually for the clients that I serve right now, it's American Sign Language. And so using the language that they have full access to, the language that is their first language, to support their acquisition and their understanding of that second language, which is English. And so, there's a lot of strategies that we use as speech language pathologists to help with language acquisition. There are different strategies, different techniques. We talk about the sandwiching and the chaining and recasting and rephrasing. There's so many different things that we do with spoken English. Those same things can be applied to sign language. So again, it's just using both of those languages depending on the individual needs of the client to support one another and really promote language acquisition, to promote cognitive development, and just overall communication, right, and expression for that child.
Thank you. One thing that's coming up is I'm thinking about being culturally competent during evaluations. And we talk a lot about different species disorder when we're talking about like AAE and Spanish. So, how would that apply when we're evaluating deaf and hard of hearing children?
I think that it's really, really critical to get a good understanding of a client's background, right? Oftentimes, we don't necessarily take that time on the front end before we even select assessments, before we even determine if an assessment is necessary. Does it have to be a formal assessment? Is it okay to do an informal assessment? We need to do, I think, as SLPs, a better job, especially as it relates to deaf and hard of hearing children, on getting more information about their background and their history with language and who has been around them and how long they've been exposed to certain languages, because all of that informs how we move forward with an evaluation. And when we talk about being culturally competent, if I know that this child has been raised in an environment where they've had no access to sound, not a whole lot of access to language, to speech or anything like that, I'm not going to come in and try to do a full battery only looking at their auditory or their spoken language skills, right? It may be a more play-based assessment, and then a lot of highly gestural, highly visual things happening in the environment to really make sure that I'm not measuring what they have not yet been exposed to and trying to, qualify them or trying to diagnose them based off of what they have not even yet had access to. It's important, I think, to know that we can do formal batteries and standardized batteries, but then outside of that, looking at dynamic assessment and really making sure that we take a step back and we're measuring our deaf and hard of hearing children fairly. If American Sign Language is not the primary language of the evaluator, or even a language that they even know or understand, I also think part of that cultural competence is to know, hey, I'm not the best person to evaluate this child, and then admitting that and finding someone making that referral or asking for that interpreter or whatever other support that we need to ensure that the evaluation is a fair one and an unbiased one, but then also inclusive of that child's background. If that does include American Sign Language or any other language, because it's not just, many of our students here, especially with me being in Arizona, many of our families are Spanish-speaking families. I don't have a client on my caseload right now that is Spanish-speaking, but if I did, that's something that I would need to admit, hey, I haven't had much experience with a child who is Spanish speaking, or with a child whose parents only speak Spanish, what kind of help then would I need? And I have already identified those that can come alongside of me to help better inform my practices and my evaluation. So I think that's a really important piece for us to keep in mind as practitioners.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Because I think that a lot of us are afraid to say no. We're afraid to turn people away. And also, we're afraid to admit that we might be incompetent in something. And so, I always say that cultural competency is a journey. So it's okay to say you don't know something. But I do, especially like how you said that you have people on backup. You basically have a plan B if you don't.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that is very important. So thank you for that. I think about people who wear hearing aids, and many SLPs are very anxious when we get children who wear hearing aids on our caseload and adults who wear hearing aids on our caseload. Because I will say in graduate school, at least in my program and many other programs that I know about, we're not necessarily trained on that. We kind of brush over the audiology portion.
Mm-hmm.
Many SLPs hate the audiology portions of our exam. So, what could you say? Just any tips, one to make us have more cultural desire in that sense of working with that population, and then also how we can be better advocates for them.
So what I would say is, don't feel like you're the only one. Even though I work primarily with deaf and hard of hearing children, I had that same feeling, that same experience. Because in grad school, like you said, we don't talk a whole lot about, like, I remember having a class for audiology, but it was different, right? We learn what's in the book. That's problematic. Number one, I won't get on a
Mhm, can
tangent talking about that. But even looking back over some of the textbooks that we had in graduate school, it was scary to me to read that. And like, it develops that pity mindset and like, oh my gosh, we need to help these deaf children. And, they can't hear, we need to make sure they have amplification, and we need to make sure that they have a cochlear implant and hearing aids, because if they can't hear, they will never talk. If they can't hear, they won't do X, Y, and Z. So I won't talk about that. But all of that is false, as we know. But the thing that is important to remember is that you're not alone. So all of us as SLPs have that same kind of feeling, because we don't talk a lot about what we call low incidence, conditions within our field. And so it's like a quick note, and then we keep on reading, or in the class you learn the book, but you don't actually have that experience with the hearing aids or with the cochlear implants or even with the deaf or hard of hearing child that can kind of help prepare you or help ease you into, working with a child who is deaf or hard of hearing later on in your practice. Some schools, not all, do have educational audiologists. And even in the district, they have educational audiologists, or they might even have teachers of the deaf. And that, for some SLPs, can be a good resource if you find yourself nervous or concerned or worried, making sure that you know who else is on the team that's working with that deaf or hard of hearing child that can come alongside of you, not only to help you, but to educate you on what you don't know. And a person that you can trust, that knows this child as well, that can answer those questions for you, that can demonstrate various things. But even before we do that, we can ask the child. I think that sometimes we forget these children and these adults live with these devices. They use these devices every single day. And sometimes they know more about the devices than we do. Depending on the age of the child, you might get some information or be able to observe that child doing various things with their devices. And, depending on their understanding of their own device, they can answer those questions. So I would always start there. And then again, that resource of a teacher of the deaf, or an educational audiologist that might be available. In terms of troubleshooting, I think those are your best options. When a device does not work, taking it out, knowing even where the battery door is, like, take some time to really inspect that device, see where the batteries are, take apart and see that ear mold, look and learn, kind of touch it. Don't be afraid to touch it. All of those things, I think we're giggling, but seriously, it's like, it really is sometimes like, oh my gosh, what do I do with this piece of equipment? I know it's expensive. I know it's valuable. I don't want to mess it up. So some of those things are what I would suggest. And then also, if a child does have a hearing aid or a cochlear implant, again, hopefully that educational audiologist has visited that school and has left, a hearing aid toolkit box. That classroom teacher should have something to be able to support, to troubleshoot, to clean that device, on the ready within that school environment. That you can also use. And I did not mention the classroom teacher, but using the classroom teacher as a resource too.
And thank you for that, because what I'm thinking about is, I like how you said to take the time to do it, because many of us listening to this are in the schools, and a lot of us are at the very end of the school year where evaluations are piling up and there simply is no time. So the first thing I would think is, as soon as you get that referral and you know that that kid has a hearing aid, start right then. Do not put it off. Do you have
Mm-hmm.
any other sentiments as far as just getting to it as a school-based SLP or a private practice SLP with a huge caseload?
Um, I don't necessarily. I didn't share much about my background with work experience, but the bulk of my experience is from a deaf school. And
Mm.
so, I started the Mississippi School for the Deaf, then left there after 9 years, moved here, worked at the Phoenix Day School for the Deaf, and then worked in a public school in a mainstream environment. And I won't, pretend like, oh, you can just call the audiologist and they'll be right there. You can call the teacher of the deaf. I know that's not how that happens. And sometimes you reach out and it may be, a week or a week and a half or 2 weeks, before you can get a response or get some support. Coming in though, I think that if we do, like you mentioned, that referral, if we do note that we have a child on our caseload who is deaf or hard of hearing, or even inheriting those IEPs, making sure that we kind of prioritize those students in a sense, because it's something that 9 times out of 10 we're not super familiar with. So the other students, and not saying that they are not just as important, but if you know that there's a student coming in or a diagnosis that you have not worked with before, then maybe prioritizing those first, and making that list of supports that you can reach out to early so that you can get that support and that help that you need.
Thank you. I think that you just saved some people's whole school years. That statement. Well, we are wrapping up. One final question I always like to ask my guest is, what would you like to see done in the field? What changes would you like to see in the field moving forward, especially when it comes to this community?
Oh, that's a loaded question. I would love to see really schools. I think it starts, and not, K through 12 institutions. I mean, higher institutions of learning. I really would love to see more colleges and universities talking more about the deaf community, especially for practitioners such as ourselves that will be working in the field of communication. I think that a lot of the myths and a lot of the misconceptions and a lot of the attitudes that we have towards working with deaf children and with their families, I believe that is heavily influenced by the training that we receive in our preparatory programs, right? And so I would love to see a different perspective taken, a different approach taken when it comes to training SLPs. And when we talk about deafness, to talk about it from a social model, right? Instead of that medical model, let's go in and fix it. Let's cure these deaf kids. Let's throw a cochlear implant or a hearing aid on every deaf child. Looking at it from a social perspective and really coming alongside families, not to convince them that they have to do surgery, but to support them, right? And to help them see, hey, your child was born deaf. They didn't fail anything. They They were identified as deaf. And here is a community that you can come alongside and that you can connect to in order to support your child, and let the discussions and the heavy decisions maybe wait a little bit. Provide them with supports first, and then kind of help them ease into a decision. I know that would be a perfect world. Another thing I would like to see is just the inclusion of deaf adults early on in a family's process, right, in their journey. Um, I work with families. Right now, my youngest client is 3 years old, but that family has yet to really connect to the deaf community. And it's not by their own choice, but certain things have not been mentioned to them, about, here's the resources, or here's what you do, or here's who you can call. There are families that want to be connected to the deaf community, but are sometimes discouraged from doing so. And so I think by us, in terms of our preparation in the colleges, like I mentioned, in universities, really opening that door and really training professionals to have a different mindset, I think that would make things much better for families and for those deaf children when they come into contact with us. And in terms of K through 12, I would love to see American Sign Language taught, in the K through 12 system, right alongside Spanish, or, presented as an elective in some of these K through 12 systems, alongside French, alongside German, Mandarin, add American Sign Language in there, and really make sure that our deaf community is represented, but then also that they have a number of communication options and partners, as they go through the educational system. So there's a lot that I want to change. There's a lot that I think, is slowly starting to shift in some ways, but I do believe that we have a long way to go. And I really, I can't thank you enough just for opening this conversation, right? And making people aware that there is a deaf community, there is a culture out there, and that it's something that we as providers, but even on a larger scale outside of what we do in terms of speech, language, and communication, that there is a whole community out here, that is often overlooked and marginalized. So I thank you for the work that you're doing.
Well, thank you, Jermaine, for the work that you're doing, and you too, Nakia. Thank you so much for the work that you are doing. Jermaine, where can people find you if they want to know more about definitely communicating, or even just any questions about how to connect better with the deaf community?
So Instagram right now is the primary place. I do have a Facebook page as well, but I don't yet have a website, which is sometimes crazy to me. I know I need to get on it, and I will soon. But Instagram is the primary place, and Definitely Communicating is spelled DEAF. Everything else is the regular spelling, but Instagram would be the place, and then on there you'll find information on how to get in contact with me in terms of email, and then any other information that's included in my bio.
Well, there, I will just say, just to give you some grace, there's kind of like a new school of thought in business that you don't even need a website. I will say that your Instagram speaks for itself. So
Thank
thank
you.
you for all the work that you put into it. It's incredible.
It's truly a labor of love, but when I tell you I love it, I love it. I love what I do. And I'm just so thankful that I'm able to get up and do it every day.
Mhm. And thank you so much, Emily, for coming. I don't know if you see her comment, Jermaine, but she's showing some gratitude for this conversation. Here
I
we
don't even know where to find the comments.
Yeah, it should be showing up on the side, but yeah, so she says, thank you for this conversation. Well, everybody, thank you so much for coming. Thank you for those who are watching the replay. I look forward to coming back next week where we talk to Dr. Donna Rice about how we can be better supervisors for interns. Until then, thank you.